Dear Sam, there was this recess game I played as a kid called Red Rover. If you've never heard of it, it's a violent game, and I imagine most schoolyards have outlawed it by now. But there was also something different about it. Not the violence part. I mean, most of our games are based on violence. There's the physical violence of something like football, or the symbolic violence of a board game like Monopoly, where in order to win, you have to make all the other players lose. But the rules of Red Rover didn't work that way. In Red Rover, two opposing teams spread out on opposite sides of a field, with each player holding the hands of the players on either side of them so that they're linked in this long daisy chain. The first team selects a member of the second team, usually the smallest or slowest one, and that person has to run across the open field and try, with their momentum, to break a pair of clasped hands on the first team. If they succeed, they return to their team victorious. If they fail, they're absorbed into the first team. And then, the second team picks a member from the first team to charge at them. And that person sprints across, either breaking the line or being caught by it, either returning victorious or being absorbed. And this continues, back and forth, teams getting bigger and smaller one player at a time, until one team only has two members left. And when that single pair of clasped hands is finally broken, they lose, and the other team wins. But here's the twist. Here's why Red Rover is different from football and from Monopoly. Unlike football, the teams aren't fixed. You might change teams a dozen times over the course of Red Rover. And unlike Monopoly, the rules aren't designed so that most people lose. In fact, in Red Rover, only 2 people lose. And everyone else, 10 people, 20 people, 30 people, however many people are playing, they all win. When I was a kid, it didn't take me long to realize that it's actually harder to lose Red Rover than it is to win it. And in that moment, all I wanted to do was lose. Because losing was actually a challenge. Right now I'm showing you footage from a game called Aqua Park. It's a free app designed to serve ads to lazy people. It's not hard to win. If you fly off the course, you get so much hang time that it's not remotely difficult to get back to the water slide. If you hit the obstacles and get slowed down, the game seems to proportionally decelerate the other players, who are all bots, to give you a chance to catch up. In fact, it's so easy to win, I quickly realized that there's no reason to even bother playing it. Everyone who downloads the game probably notices that after a few minutes. But when I noticed it, I didn't delete the app. No, I thought of a new challenge for myself. The challenge of what I call the no-touch win. That is, I asked, was it possible to win Aqua Park without interacting with it at all? I became obsessed with letting the game just run, to see if it could win on its own without me doing anything. And the answer, amazingly enough, is yes. Yes, it is possible. So far, everything I've shown you on screen is one of those rare no-touch wins. I've been reflecting on that impulse recently. You know, that because the game was too easy, I invented a secret objective that I was playing toward to make it more difficult and interesting again. It's like gamers who do pacifist runs of first-person shooters. Everything about the design of a first-person shooter tells the player to pick up a gun and start firing. At no point does the design of a first-person shooter even suggest another option. What should we do with this? I mean, how should we interpret this? If all media is teaching us something, then what's the design of a first-person shooter teaching the player? Is it teaching them to think for themselves? Is it teaching them to take a more difficult path? Or is it teaching them to just fall in line and bring violence into a world designed for violence? I sometimes wonder whether games are meant to prepare us for how the world is, or whether they're priming us to reproduce how the world is. I mean, if most of the games we played as kids had been collaborative or cooperative rather than player versus player or team versus team, how would we look at politics differently? Or the economy, or healthcare, or the meaning of life? And what about mainstream movies? Like most games, they revolve around a heroic protagonist that the viewer is meant to identify with, and the story is often a series of quests that pit the protagonist against greater and greater obstacles until they emerge victorious. It seems to me that whether you're directly controlling the actions of an avatar or just identifying with the protagonist psychologically, is a minor difference. In both cases, most mainstream games and most movies tell the same kinds of stories with the same kinds of endings. But there's an apparent contradiction here. Video games present themselves to us as being all about our freedom of choice. But to play a video game is to constantly encounter limitations, parts of the map where we can't go, objects that we can't pick up, or actions that we can think of but can't take. Meanwhile, movies are the opposite. We as spectators have no choices at all, but mainstream narrative films tend to give us protagonists who become heroes by getting around the restrictions of their world. Whereas we as gamers are stuck inside the game's programming and can only win by mastering it, the heroes in our favorite movies win precisely because they can innovate their way around the rules. Of course, it wasn't always this way. Go back to the earliest cinema, before 1900, and there were no heroes at all. At the time, some of the most popular films around were nicknamed phantom rides. In the Phantom Ride, the camera was mounted on a train or a trolley car to give the spectator the virtual thrill of travel, of being somewhere else in the world, gliding through space. The thing that strikes me, though, is that I don't think that Phantom Rides were ever shot in a car or a horse-drawn carriage or handheld. They were always shot on trains. And because they were shot on trains, they never even simulate a sense of free travel. The spectators, and even the camera operators, are held captive by choices that a transportation engineer made well in advance. The train, and thus the camera, only gets to go in a path predetermined by where the tracks were laid down years before. Now, you'd think that narrative filmmaking would have solved this problem of foregone railroading, but in the past few decades, it seems like video game aesthetics have seeped back into blockbuster filmmaking. Like in a movie like Total Recall, the story follows the familiar gaming moments of character creation, clearly defined quests, and even a final boss. In the Pixar movie Brave, Merida doesn't really have free will in the narrative because she's constantly following a Pac-Man trail of will-o'-the-wisps that tell her exactly where to go and what to do to solve her problem. If you squint the right way, you'll see the residues of game logic everywhere. The regularly scheduled fights in superhero films, the puzzle and survival logics in slasher movies, and the over-obvious emphasis on goals and rules in action, sci-fi, and most everywhere else. So, where do we find ourselves? Games promise to set us free as players, but no matter how big they make the sandbox, the player's still restricted to the tracks laid down by the developers. And movies use narrative to set their protagonists free of the constraints of the world, only to just put them right back into rule-based boxes that feel more and more like games. So what are we to do? For me, I think it's up to us to recognize that no matter what structures the game designers, screenwriters, and even transportation engineers put into their creations, we still have some choice in the way we interact. We can try to lose Red Rover, or we can do pacifist runs, or we can refuse to touch Aqua Park at all, turning it into a phantom ride where... well, whoops. Okay, most of the time we actually lose. And when it comes to movies, we can watch Avengers Endgame on fast reverse, or lie down on the floor in the front row of the theater until the movie's just flashing lights. Or, and here's our real power, if we realize that no form of interaction with the game helps us or the world, we can stick one final unbelievable landing and then turn it off. In fact, when the world's on fire, turning it off might be the most important choice we can make. Thanks for watching, Sam. Best wishes for you, your channel. Please keep making your videos. I can't wait to see what you come up with in 2022. Sincerely, Max Talene.